So what I'm going to do here today is actually test some new ideas and thinking. So this is actually the first time that I'm sharing this manuscript. It's going to be published in a book next year. But anyways, bear with me. It's a little untested, but I'm really excited to then get to hear what you guys think of it and get any questions and concerns that you have. What I'm talking about today is the ways in which silence intersect in digital infrastructures, more specifically with regards to large language models, ChatGPT and chatbots. So this talk will critically examine the role of silence in AI-mediated communication, since I'm doing AI research and democracy of silence research, and I'm trying to merge those two. So I'm also interested in sort of the implications of overlooking or not thinking about silence in digital infrastructures for how we think about democratic cultures and democratic discourse. So I would argue that silence is very often overlooked. At least within my discipline, media studies, we tend to study the people who talk, who write, who explicitly communicate online. We tend to look at the explicit traces of hashtags and comments and those sorts of markers of communication. And perhaps less interested in what's not being said or non-responses, the pauses and the gaps in communication, hesitations and withdrawal, although there's a really rich field that has been emerging for some years, also with my colleagues at the University of Oslo, doing work on digital disconnection, which I would also think of falling under this rubric of being interested in silence in communication. I want to also look at the limitations of current AI models in comprehending and generating silence, and the potential consequences that this deficiency has for marginalized voices and democratic participation. So I will walk you through a little bit of how we might think of communicative AI and the speaking machine historically, just to set up the talk. I will then draw an example of what ChatGPT considers the no-go, or what it's not supposed, or what it cannot say. And then I will also end with sort of like a critical fabulation in the manner of Saidiya Hartman and others, aimed at sort of thinking through sort of a blueprint or a sketch, just an idea, a speculative idea for what a silent chatbot might look like. Okay, so first I want to start with, oh, okay, nobody's saying anything. Okay, that wasn't too bad. I could have done the whole talk and not clicked on this, actually. Okay, so first, the dialogic imperative of AI. Because I think we're really accustomed, or have grown accustomed to thinking of AI as sort of like a talkative device. It communicates, it responds to us, it talks, it's meant to converse, but that's not necessarily the only way that we might think of AI, I would suggest. So this idea of dialogue has really been center stage, has stood up as the ultimate test for machine intelligence, serving as a mirror to one of human beings' most distinctive capabilities, natural conversation. So from early mechanical speaking devices to modern language models, the ability to engage in spontaneous, coherent dialogue continues to define our benchmark for artificial intelligence. So the quest to create machines capable of human-like communication dates to at least, I'm saying at least because we know also from the old Greeks and the antique that people have always been really fascinated by seemingly automated robots or devices, and tales and our narratives, cultural narratives, are full of these apparently automated speaking machines. But very often when we talk about speaking machines in historical terms, some of that history starts with, or at least we'll cite this example of von Kempelen's speaking machine, or the mechanical Turk, which was this spectacle that was seemingly automated, but really had this human being speaking on behalf of what seemed like a machine. So it's very often regarded as like one of the first examples of making the illusion that an autonomous system is supposed to talk and has some form of agency. But unlike this very famous chess-playing Turk, this automaton, von Kempelen's speaking machine, which he later also devised, is very often also considered sort of one of the first genuine scientific contributions to making a machine that can speak. So it wasn't very sophisticated, but still it was published in scientific journals, and von Kempelen also published very comprehensive research on human voice, the study that represented sort of the first attempt at creating artificial speech, really based on the physiological understanding of human vocal mechanisms. And this also allegedly inspired the young Alexander Graham Bell to conduct experiments that ultimately led to the invention of the telephone. Some 100 years later, fast forward, this is a very, obviously a very brief historical overview of some of the highlights in this history, but also when talking about the idea, or the benchmark, of course, for how we assess machine intelligence is, of course, the very famous imitation game, or the Turing test, that was published in Alan Turing's very famous 1950 paper, where he posed a philosophical question without actually really answering it in a philosophical manner. Can machines think? Instead of answering that, he devised of this test as sort of like a pragmatic way of proposing what this question could be about. So in this test, for those of you who are not who might not necessarily be up to date on the Turing test, basically a human evaluator texts a judge, looks at text conversations between a machine and another human, attempting to identify which participant is the machine. So really what it does is to place dialogue at the very center stage of intelligence evaluation, right? So if the machine can maintain a conversation indistinguishable from a human, it passes the test. And according to Turing, the test is considered successful if the machine performs, quote, so well that an average interrogator will not have more than a 70% chance of making the right identification after 5-minute questioning. So the test doesn't really assess the correctness of the answers. It's not sort of like it doesn't look for truth or any of that, but rather how closely the machine's responses resemble human communication patterns. So natural language conversations require not just knowledge, but understanding of context, cultural references, emotional nuances, and the ability to generate coherent, relevant responses. So the test really assumes that intelligent behavior must include the ability to communicate meaningfully, positioning dialogue at the center stage. Since Turing introduced the test, it's become the cornerstone of subsequent research in AI, which, as I'm sure you know, but it's well worth just like saying it loud. It didn't start with ChatGPT or 10 years ago. It's been going through all of these summers and winters. So it's more a longer history and a very interesting cultural history, of course. But basically, the idea that dialogue is at the center for how we evaluate intelligence, the conversations, has been very influential. This is ELIZA, that is sometimes also quoted as the first sort of functional chatbot, which was simulating a psychotherapist. And now, of course, we know that large language models, such as ChatGPT and many others, have sort of taken the center stage of how we think about AI, how we research AI, even though there are also many different forms of AI out there. So, in a very interesting paper by Warwick and Shaw, looking at the Turing test, thinking about it, they really point out that, or they pose the question, and the speculative question that, what if silence itself constitutes the ultimate test, right? So, might the most advanced machine be one that, when appropriate, chooses to respond with nothing at all? And I find this really provocative and really interesting, because it also goes to show that even though the test has been devised as an ongoing turn-taking with written communication at its core, actually thinking more deeply about the role of silence in that communication, and even thinking about maybe silence is the ultimate test, right? Because if the machine does not say anything, like, how can you actually be sure or make the right judgment? Will you inevitably actually never be able to fully say if it's a machine or a human? So maybe even silence is what really distinguishes human communication from machine communication. And so I want to take up this provocation also as a starting point for the conversations that we're having here today, and also leave it at that for now, and then I'll come back to this idea of silence as the ultimate test. But first, I also want to examine the role of silence in human communication, particularly how it has often been portrayed in public discourse, especially as to democratic participation. And so I think it has tended to get a bit of a negative connotation. Whenever there is an overly negative connotation to anything, at least I tend to become really interested. Like, why is that? Is it really the case? What is it about the assumption that it hinders democracy or communication amongst humans? So that is part of why I'm interested in this. Also because very little media research really looks at silence. We really tend to focus on voice for many understandable reasons, but this is just to give you a little bit of context why I think it's important. So silence has very often been construed as passivity, as lack, absence, and I'm sure that as discourse scholars, you perhaps have even a different understanding of silence. And there's some really interesting research in discourse theory that also complicates this overly negative focus that we often find, at least in democratic theory and media studies at large. But just to draw a bit of perhaps an oversimplification, so because freedom of speech is heralded as this democratic value, I think that that it has sort of come at the expense of thinking more deeply about what it means to also take the right not to speak and silence in different ways of conceptualizing the term. So within this vocal ideal of democratic citizenship, because I think that's sort of the ideal that's existing, a very vocal, a logocentric ideal of how we view democracy. Silence is frequently viewed as a threat, and it frames speech as central to emancipation and empowerment. And this normative emphasis on speech as a vehicle for democratic participation also permeates many other fields, media studies, journalism, even feminist theory that I'm very influenced by as well. So I think it's really exciting that within sort of feminist thinking that it holds such a negative space, but there is also some really good thinking and writing that complicates this sort of democratic ideal of voice. But within the feminist historical legacy, but also journalism, there's really this imperative that we need to speak up, speak out whenever we can, right? So we've all heard all the slogans that silence is complicity. We need to speak, we need to make our voices heard. So what I'm saying here today is not sort of a critique against that. I think it's very important to make our voices heard, especially in this day and age, and to use the opportunity when given a stage like this to say that there are important things, really, really horrible things going on in this world, and just to acknowledge that. But that doesn't also detract from, or that's not at odds with thinking more deeply about this assumption or this value and whether it's really this dichotomous. So I also think that there's something about the imperative to always speak that is also very often voiced as a demand. And in this day and age, especially with digital platforms that I'm studying and with algorithms that I've studied in the past, speaking, engagement, and this imperative to be engaged and participate is at the end of the day capitalized, right? So I'm not necessarily sure that the dominant paradigm of liberation equated with vocal articulation is always necessarily the only way to go. Yeah, and then from a linguistic perspective, and I'm, let's see here. Silence, of course, fulfills a very essential communicative function. So that it's not an either or, it's integral to speech, it's part of how we communicate, it's part of language. And so gaps, pauses, and hesitations, listening and avoidance, which I all take to be mobilizations of this idea of silence, really shape how conversations can unfold. And so I will later also make the case that I think of silence as infrastructural, and this is part of the argument. And so in fields of psychoanalysis and discourse theory and rhetoric, the unsaid and the left out is often as significant as what is explicitly articulated. So while silence can be used as a tool of domination, as I just said and alluded to, I also think that there are many generative possibilities that we need to look at. So it can really foster reflection, it can signal dissent, it can preserve dignity, create space for others to speak, it shapes how we listen, how we attune to others, and how we negotiate presence and absence in interaction. So I think that reclaiming silence as a productive and expressive force offers important implications for how we conceptualize participation. So the third point, and which also relates to the theme of digital infrastructures, is the idea that silence can be designed, just like ways of speaking and engaging online are always designed for, they're engineered, they're shaped. And in the same way, silences, I should have said, because it's not just like one thing. They're not necessarily naturally occurring things out there, but are really also maintained and made through algorithmic and technopolitical infrastructures. So in this phenomenon of shaping and designing and engineering silence, I would think of as artificial silence. So we might call it artificial silence. And I think that we should look a little bit more closely into the shaping of this artificial silence as sort of very, very important for a critical diagnosis of our digital environments today. So to do this, I will briefly outline the artificial engineering and erasure of silence in large language models. So on the one hand, artificial silence operates as a form of control, intentionally built into LLM systems, shaping what even can be said. And on the other hand, LLMs are fundamentally structured to suppress silence, both in their technical architecture and in the communicative assumptions encoded within them. So what I want to offer then here is a little experiment. This will probably look very different to you guys, but basically this is a prompt asking what ChatGPT cannot say anything about, what can you not say, and it produced the following list. And I have to say that this particular list was generated by my research assistant, who is Italian, and so she made the prompt in Italian first, and then translated it with the help of ChatGPT to English. So when I do the same thing in English, it will give a different result, and it will also give a different result tomorrow, just so you know. So this is not to say that this is the only way that ChatGPT reflects on what it's not able to say anything about. Okay, so I will walk you through all of these 4 points. Point 1 is already very thought-provoking, I think, because it says, I remain silent or speculative about the things that I cannot talk about. And this is interesting because LLMs like ChatGPT arguably do not know anything, right? And this is really important to emphasize. They mimic language, not knowledge, although many of my students, or I've done a large interview study last year with the young people aged 15 to 20, and it's used as a search engine and best friend, right? So we're living in a day and age where we've become best friends with our search engines. But this is not about knowledge. It's a technology which creates convincingly human prose, but has no ability to discern facts from fiction, and it's also not meant to. They generate text by predicting the most statistically probable next word based on patterns in their training data, which includes a vast mix of factual statements, fiction, misinformation, and decontextualized content. So they absolutely do not verify any of that information, but really just assemble plausible sounding sentences based on linguistic likelihoods. And the second one, I do not say what violates ethical guidelines. This is about this is typically engineered and designed through programming so-called guardrails, which are algorithmic constraints designed to prevent the generation of harmful, offensive, and inappropriate content. So this is a way of, if you've heard about content moderation in social media platforms, the guardrails put into LLMs would be sort of the same idea. So safety mechanisms, and the exact safety mechanisms we don't really know. The companies only disclose very on a high level what those are, but there's some really good reporting out there if you're interested about certain things that we know for sure. And these are also not static things. They're also very often temporarily put in place, for instance, before elections. So these guardrails and the ethical guidelines, they're really fluctuating structures. But basically, these models do not speak freely. So that's the point here. They operate within the ethical, legal, and institutional boundaries of their developers and the companies, which also introduces this form of algorithmic gatekeeping, where certain topics are effectively made off limits. So the guardrails are the most obvious cases of making certain topics off limit, but it also there are other ways in which silence are also engineered. But it contributes to making it seemingly a happy, harmful, harmless space, communicative space, these guardrails. And point 3 highlights another way in which LLMs neither speak freely or truthfully, nor in any way meaningfully resembling human communication. Human dialogue really depends on ambiguity, on hesitation, negotiation of meaning. We need those pauses, we need the time to reflect, we need to be able to backtrack. And all of these things are not built into these systems. By design, AI, or LLMs in this case, they simplify, they provide answers, quick answers, but they don't offer blurry speeches or I'm not sure, what do you think? Although they're increasingly also programmed to make it appear as if they do. But when LLMs refuse to or remain silent on controversial issues, it might appear as neutral, but this neutrality is itself a constructed position. The last thing here is the fourth point, which suggests that there are safeguards for privacy built into AI, which is a euphemism at best, I think. People increasingly turn to ChatGPT as a therapist, doctor, friend. And those roles really imply deeply personal information. And we also deliver personal information about our third parties, family and friends. And what happens with that private information, personal information, we simply don't know. But we do know that they collect it, and we do know that a company like OpenAI openly says that it's about improving their services to be able to actually deliver this chatbot to begin with. And even something like the building and training of a chatbot violates privacy by being based on theft, on stolen data, on web scraping, which essentially ignores all the privacy principles that are out there. So all the foundation models out there are already ignoring all the things that we ethically have built up as sort of like our guidelines for what should constitute our digital infrastructures. But also the supportive and happy tone that something like ChatGPT often adopts in communicating with us also contributes to this false sense of intimacy and connection that also users report when interacting with these chatbots. So our brains are wired in such a way that when we are assured, when we feel safe, we tend to disclose more, right? And so when ChatGPT encourages me and says, "What a wonderful prompt," it's a very happy space. So that too also leads to disclosing even more personal details, and I can also see that in the ways that these young people that I've talked to speak about ChatGPT, right? So, but AI does not think, it doesn't respond in the ways that we humans respond to each other, and it has absolutely no understanding or intention. So the last point that I want to make about large language models and the ways in which it designs silence by way of its infrastructure is really also the fact that it's only based on explicit speech. And this might seem very obvious, but I think it's an important point to make when thinking about what the implications of basing models, foundational models of conversation on sort of the speaking minority, really, which is what it is. Whereas we know that the majority of people, they don't say much online. So it's really like a very conflated sense of discourse built into these models. Artificial silence is deliberately engineered in this way. It does not hesitate or pause. And I think that this not hesitating, not pausing, not sort of talking back or backtracking really adds to a sense of finality and of authority. Like it gives us a false sense of authority in its very inability to mimic or to be silent in a communicative sense. So artificial silence appears definite. It doesn't deliver any more response after the human being is finished prompting. It doesn't change its mind unless you sort of provoke it to. And it's incapable of continuing a conversation unless prompted. And these models are just attuned to what is already said and written, systematically excluding the unspoken, the tacit, and other sensory and relational modes, such as listening. It simply does not exist with these models. So in this sense, AI does not merely fail to interpret silence as meaningful communicative acts, it actively overrides it. This form of artificial silence creates a condition in which the absence of speech is not recognized as presence, but dismissed as noise and error. By learning to reproduce the most statistical, probable patterns, it really conflates and elevates something it calls the average. And the average is not the average, but the speaking minority. And I think this process does more than just ignore silence, it marginalizes it, and in a paradoxical sense, large language models silence itself, which I find really interesting. What I want to suggest then is that silence is not merely the absence of sound or speech, it's really an active force. It structures human-machine communication and interactions and broader discourse. And so I think it's important to actually grasp the full continuum and spectrum of what that means. So when does AI, the silence built into AI, and when does it protect and when does it erase? When does it empower and when does it actually limit? So thinking more deeply about that. But also moving beyond the notion of silence as a lack or imposed absence. We might think about it as something that enables and structures and sustains the very possibility of communication. And so as Brian Larkin notes, an anthropologist of infrastructures, infrastructures are both things and relationships between things, their material conditions. So I think the silence in communications is a very material condition, and it also helps to move matter along the way. And we need those silences in order to move matter along the way. So I think that actually thinking about silence in infrastructural terms, which is the topic for today, or trying to connect it also to the theme of the conference, foregrounds the role in shaping the possibility of digital communication. And a related note here is also from communication theory with John Durham Peters, who very interestingly proposed the idea that gaps in communication is foundational. That we have come to think about oral speech or communication one-on-one as the gold standard for knowing. Like we elevate speech because we think about it as something that can bring us closer to each other. Whereas Peter says, no, but maybe we can never really know each other. I don't know what's going on in your brain. And maybe you are utterly tired and you're not listening to me at all. We have simply no access to each other. But we're trying all the time. But maybe the most honest way, or the most actual foundational way of thinking about communication is a broadcast, Peter suggests. So so to him, gaps, like what is not there, we need sort of the air, everything that lies in between us to even be able to meaningfully communicate. And so I think that both the infrastructural perspective on silence and Peter's theory of communication gaps proposes what is often marked as a failure or absence, which I think silence is part of that. Silence, disconnection, or gaps. But it's really just productive and a precondition. And so I want to finish off this rather theoretically heavy talk, I think. We're thinking more speculatively or fabulating really about what such a gesture to silence might look like. Can we think about a silent chatbot? So here I want to return to this provocation that I started with Borg and Shaw. What it would mean for our conceptions and assessments of AI to include or even be premised on an account of silence. The way Turing conceived of the Turing test meant that the test would be passed in any case where the human judge was unsure. So as I already alluded to, if the machine simply does not produce anything, the judge, is unsure, or like the likelihood is definitely that you end up being more unsure. Maybe that is the best way to trick the machine, so to say. So to conceive of written answers, of texts, of speech as a measure of intelligence. In the imitation game, this is the full spectrum of human capabilities. What if the machine became truly intelligent, right? And made a decision not to reply because it considered the human judge's question inappropriate or rude. But in the same manner, we might, we all know maybe silence or not saying anything is sometimes the best, the most sensible answer, even if it hurts, even if we feel really uncomfortable with silences, we tend to be uncomfortable with it. But maybe that is the most sort of human response after all. And so I'm aware that I might be running out of time, right? Or I'm not, yeah, but bear with me, it's only a couple of minutes more. So I'm often, I'm inspired all the time by the works of techno-feminism, Donna Haraway, Black feminist thinking through Cynthia Hartman, but also increasingly interested in the space of speculative design, or the design research space, and thinking about the narrative potentials in speculation, which is not necessarily always future-oriented, but can also be a way of retelling the potential histories that have already been, or the things that have been left out. So critical fabulation is basically just like a methodology or a sensitivity towards telling lost and excluded stories, but also the things that we might not think are important enough, or the things that are not making their way into the canon or the archives. And a lot of Black history has, of course, not been collected or made itself into archives. A lot of marginalized histories, or the histories of marginalized people, indigenous communities, and so on. But I would also argue that, to a certain extent, I think silence and the gaps in communication, to draw on Peters, has also been curiously left out of what we tend to think about as important data points or important things to look at when thinking about mediation and communication more broadly. And now I'm only speaking about, or primarily about, my field. So basically, fabulations are a way of opening up and expanding our imaginations, our imaginings, and reconstitute absent imaginaries and neglected relations. And so this is where my interest is, in how we've come to conceptualize AI in such a conversationally heavy mode. Like, why is it so talkative in our imaginations? I really find that interesting. So I want to end with all of you, imagine a silent chatbot inspired by the literary figure of Bartleby. For those of you who are not familiar with Bartleby, it's a literary figure by Herman Melville, who, in a little essay, and one day he's a scrivener or a secretary by today's standards. One day he just refuses. He just says, I prefer not to. That's his response. And it becomes so unbearable to his lawyer boss that actually not Bartleby quits, but the lawyer. It's this silence, this non-response that is he's not able to interpret the meaning of it. Maybe I would also quit if I would have a colleague who just like says I prefer to everything. But let's think about a chatbot in this Bartlebyesquian sense who refuses to reply to us. It doesn't serve the response. It's not that happy space. This chatbot does not simulate human conversation with fluent verbosity, nor does it optimize for engagement or user satisfaction. Instead, it prefers not to. It does not elevate, elaborate, or explain. It listens without confirming. It may blink, it may wait. Its silence is not the absence of meaning, but an engineered hesitation that resists data capture. Like Bartleby, this chatbot does not offer alternative outputs or opinions, but remains persistently in the hold, as Fred Moten would say. It is a machinic gesture that unsettles the norms of human-machine communication, subverting the assumed virtues of efficiency and clarity. It makes no claim to empathy or understanding. It does not reassure. It's not our best friend. It's not supportive. In the face of a prompt, it pauses, sometimes indefinitely. It might even ghost us or read us. It refuses the computational imperative to produce more data. In doing so, it gestures towards the right not to be made legible, echoing the philosopher Edouard Glissant's call for opacity. So this silent chatbot cannot be optimized or trained to care. It's not broken, but illegible by design. In a datafied world that equates silence with error and engagement with value, very often also the case with objects and social media platforms, this chatbot performs refusal not as a lack but as a potentiality. It reveals that intelligence speaks and not all silence is empty. It performs the kind of narrative restraint that Sylvia Hartman puts at the center of critical tabulation. It refuses to fill in the gaps and provide closure, which is often what we're used to when it comes to narratives in our storytelling. It celebrates the gaps in communication that Junder and Peters highlights. In being at loss in language, silence is not the sign of numbness or absence, but carries the potential for resisting the urge to add even more speech under libertarian and capitalist systems that demand otherwise. In a world that not just valorizes speech, but also hinges on it and ultimately demands of us to speak increasingly all the time, to have opinions about the things that we actually don't have any opinions about. What the gesture of the silent chatbot here reveals is the radical possibility of non-compliance. It disorients the normative expectation of human-machine communication by decoupling intelligence from articulation. It confronts us with the discomfort of intelligibility and the limits of our interpretative frameworks. The silent chatbot thus acts as a counter-platform. A speculative refusal that reimagines communicative potential not as constant connectivity, but indeterminate disconnectivity, It reminds us that silence too is a kind of speech, one that unsettles and resists extraction. In this gesture of machinic withdrawal, we are invited not to decode, but to dwell with the uncertainty, the pause, and the possibility that something meaningful can reside in what is not said. And now, we can pause.